Bethany McGee sits on the train looking at her phone, her back toward the aisle. She's 26 years old, heading home after a normal Sunday evening, completely unaware of what's about to happen. A man stands up from his seat a few rows behind her. He's holding a plastic bottle. He walks down the aisle toward Bethany, moving deliberately, purposefully, and when he reaches her, he removes the cap from the bottle. Then he pours the contents all over Bethany's head and body. Gasoline. The smell fills the train car instantly, sharp and overwhelming, and Bethany realizes what's happening. She tries to fight him off and runs toward the front of the train, gasoline soaking through her hair and clothes. The man chases her down the carriage. He ignites the bottle in his hand, and the remaining gasoline inside catches fire. The flaming bottle falls to the floor. He picks it up, approaches Bethany again, and sets her on fire. Bethany McGee's body becomes engulfed in flames. For 1 full minute, she burns while passengers watch in horror, some frozen in shock, some screaming, some recording on their phones. The train stops at the platform and Bethany, still on fire, manages to exit before collapsing. People rush to help, using coats to smother the flames, but the damage is already done. 60% of Bethany's body is covered in burns. The man who did this? Lawrence Reed, 50 years old, with 72 arrests over 30 years. He'd been convicted of arson and given probation. He'd assaulted a healthcare worker and been released on electronic monitoring. He'd violated his curfew 5 times in the past week, including that morning, and nobody stopped him. This is the story of how a career criminal with 72 arrests was free to set an innocent woman on fire on public transit, and how every part of the system failed to stop him. Bethany McGee was 26 years old in November 2025 and worked as a business research analyst at Caterpillar. She lived in Upland, Indiana, surrounded by a close-knit family who loved her deeply. She was a devout Christian, an active member of her church community, and the kind of person who made the world better just by being in it. On the 17th of November 2025, Bethany was doing something millions of Americans do every single day: riding public transit. She was on the Chicago Blue Line, looking at her phone, minding her own business. She had no way of knowing that the man sitting behind her had been given chance after chance by a system that kept releasing him despite 72 arrests, despite a history of violence, despite every warning sign that he was dangerous. Lawrence Reed was 50 years old in November 2025 and had been cycling through Chicago's criminal justice system for over 30 years. He had a documented history of mental illness and had been a psychiatric patient at both Hartgrove Hospital and McNeil Hospital. Lawrence Reed had been arrested 72 times since he was 18 years old. 72 arrests. Over 3 decades, Reed had racked up at least 15 arrests since 2016 alone and had been convicted 15 times total, including 8 felony convictions and 7 misdemeanor convictions. His criminal record included arson, criminal damage to government property, drug trafficking, drug possession, felony traffic offenses, multiple batteries, trespassing, and various other charges that painted a clear picture of someone who'd spent his entire adult life breaking the law. While Reed was building this criminal record, Bethany was building a life. Her father, Dr. Gregory McGee, was a professor of biblical studies at Taylor University, a Christian college in Indiana. Her mother, Emily, and her 2 brothers, Mark and John, formed the kind of family that actually spent time together by choice, not obligation. They went hiking together, played games together, attended church together, and genuinely enjoyed each other's company. But the system kept giving Reed chances. Over and over and over again, the system looked at his record, looked at his pattern of behavior, and decided he deserved another opportunity to prove he could be a functioning member of society. And every single time, Reed proved them wrong. On the 23rd of April 2020, Reed was charged with aggravated arson after he set a fire outside the Thompson Center, a government building in Chicago, just minutes before Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker was scheduled to give a COVID-19 press conference inside. Think about that for a moment. Reed set a fire at a government building where the governor was about to speak. That's not a small crime. That's not a mistake. That's a deliberate act of arson targeting a specific location at a specific time. What was Reed's punishment? Probation. No prison time. Just probation. His probation ended on the 28th of December 2023, and Reed was once again a free man with no supervision and no consequences for setting fire to a government building. In 2019, Reed had been convicted of damaging CTA Blue Line train windows at O'Hare International Airport. He was sentenced to probation for that too. He'd also been convicted of breaking a Cook County Department of Corrections computer and received probation for that as well. The pattern was clear. Reed committed crimes, sometimes serious crimes, and the system responded with probation instead of prison. Bethany's colleagues at Caterpillar described her as intelligent, steady-minded, and kind. She wasn't the loudest person in the room, but she was the person you wanted on your team because she was reliable, thoughtful, and genuinely cared about doing good work. Bethany was also an animal lover who'd previously attended Black Lives Matter rallies, showing her compassion extended beyond just the people she knew personally to issues of justice and equality in her community. Faith wasn't just something Bethany talked about on Sundays, but something that shaped how she lived her life. She had no idea that while she was living this life, a man with 72 arrests was about to collide with her world in the most horrific way possible. Then came the 19th of August 2025, just 3 months before he attacked Bethany McGee. Reed was a psychiatric patient at McNeil Hospital in Berwyn, Illinois, and while he was there, he allegedly struck and punched a social worker in the head and face. The social worker was just doing their job, trying to help Reed, and Reed assaulted them. Reed was charged with aggravated battery, a serious charge that should have resulted in him being held in custody, especially given his extensive criminal history. Prosecutors objected to his release and told the judge that Reed was dangerous and should remain in jail. The judge disagreed and released Reed on electronic monitoring, which meant he'd be fitted with an ankle monitor and required to follow a curfew and stay at an assigned location. Reed walked out of jail wearing an ankle monitor, supposedly being supervised by the court system, supposedly being tracked to ensure he followed the rules. But electronic monitoring only works if someone is actually watching and if someone takes action when violations occur. In November 2025, Lawrence Reed violated his electronic monitoring curfew 5 times in just over a week. November 9th, curfew violation, no action taken. November 12th, curfew violation, no action taken. November 14th, curfew violation, no action taken. November 15th, curfew violation, no action taken. That same day, Reed was suspected of attempting to set the Chicago City Hall County building on fire. November 17th, the day he attacked Bethany McGee, curfew violation detected at 9:13 a.m. 2 escalated alerts were issued, one at 12:13 p.m. and another 12 hours later, but nobody did anything. The attack happened at 9:30 p.m. that same night. The pretrial case officer responsible for monitoring Reed didn't notify the judge about any of these violations until November 20th, 2 full days after Reed had set Bethany on fire. Reed was also AWOL from his assigned transitional housing and had been bouncing between shelters, which meant the system had essentially lost track of where he was living while he was supposedly being monitored. By the 17th of November 2025, Lawrence Reed had been arrested 72 times, convicted of arson and given probation, released on electronic monitoring despite prosecutors' objections, violated his curfew 5 times in 1 week, and the system's response was nothing. And Bethany McGee, who had grown up on the island of Alanisos after her family relocated when she was just 8 years old, who had embraced her beachside life and was passionate about both scuba diving and swimming, who was simply riding the train home on a Sunday evening, was about to pay the price for every single one of those failures. Around 9 to 9:10 p.m. on November 17th, Lawrence Reed walked into a gas station in Chicago's Garfield Park area, approximately 20 to 30 minutes before the attack. Surveillance cameras captured him clearly as he approached one of the gas pumps, pulled out a plastic bottle, and began filling it with gasoline. His face was visible on camera, and there was nothing hurried or panicked about his movements. Reed filled the bottle, capped it, and left the gas station carrying a container filled with an accelerant that could turn a human being into a living torch. Between 9:15 and 9:20 p.m., Reed boarded a Chicago Transit Authority Blue Line train near the Clark and Lake Street station. He was carrying the bottle filled with gasoline, and he found a seat in train car number 3236. Other passengers were on the train going about their evenings, heading home from work or visiting friends, doing exactly what people do on Sunday nights in a major city. Nobody noticed anything unusual about Reed. He was just another passenger on a crowded train. Bethany McGee was sitting several rows ahead of Reed with her back toward the aisle, looking at her phone. She was completely unaware of his presence and had no reason to think anything was wrong. Reed sat and watched and waited. At approximately 9:30 p.m., Reed stood up from his seat, still holding the plastic bottle. He walked down the aisle toward Bethany, moving purposefully but not in a way that would immediately alarm other passengers. He positioned himself directly behind her and removed the cap from the bottle. In seconds, everything was about to change. What happened next was captured on surveillance cameras throughout the train. Multiple witnesses saw it unfold. Some recorded it on their phones. And for 1 full minute, Bethany McGee would burn while a train car full of people watched in horror. Reed pours the gasoline from the bottle all over Bethany's head and body. The liquid soaks through her hair, runs down her face, drenches her clothes. The smell hits her first, sharp and overwhelming and unmistakable, and she realizes what's happening. Bethany fights back. She pushes Reed away and runs toward the front of the train car, gasoline still dripping from her body, her mind racing to understand what's happening and how to escape. Reed chases her down the carriage. He ignites the bottle in his hand, and the remaining gasoline inside catches fire, flames erupting from the opening. The bottle falls from his hand onto the floor of the train, still burning. Bethany runs toward the rear of the train now, trying to get away, trying to reach the door, trying to escape, but there's nowhere to go because they're moving, and the train hasn't stopped yet. Reed picks up the burning bottle from the floor. He approaches Bethany again, this time with the flaming bottle in his hand, and he sets her on fire. Bethany McGee's body becomes engulfed in flames. Her hair, her face, her arms, her clothes, everything is burning. According to the criminal complaint filed later, Reed yells, "Burn alive, bitch! Burn, bitch!" As he watches her burn. Reed runs to the front of the train car and stands there watching Bethany as she burns. Bethany, almost fully engulfed in flames, drops to the ground and rolls desperately, trying to extinguish herself. The fire burns for approximately 1 full minute. 60 seconds of unimaginable agony. Passengers scream. Some stand frozen in shock, unable to process what they're seeing. Some pull out their phones and record, a decision that would later be criticized by the people who actually helped. The train pulls into Clark and Lake Street Station, and the doors open. Bethany, still on fire, manages to exit the train before collapsing on the platform. People on the platform rush toward her. One person uses their coat to smother the flames, pressing the fabric against Bethany's burning body to cut off the oxygen feeding the fire. Others kneel beside her, talking to her, comforting her, staying with her. One witness would later say that sitting with Bethany and talking to her during those critical moments was really important, that keeping her conscious and aware was essential until paramedics arrived. The entire station smells like burnt hair, a smell that witnesses would describe as unforgettable and sickening. Lawrence Reed exits the train car at the same stop and walks away from the scene calmly, as if nothing happened. He has burns on his right hand from handling the fire, but otherwise he's uninjured. He disappears into the night. Emergency medical personnel arrive and find Bethany with severe burns covering approximately 60% of her body. Her face, her head, her arms, all burned. The most severe burns are on her left arm and hand. She's conscious, but in excruciating pain. Paramedics stabilize her as best they can and rush her to Stroger Hospital's burn unit in critical condition. Bethany McGee had been on fire for 1 full minute. She would spend the next 3 months in the hospital undergoing surgeries and treatment for burns covering 60% of her body. And Lawrence Reed, the man with 72 arrests, who'd been released on electronic monitoring despite prosecutors' objections, walked away like it was just another Sunday night. On the 18th of November 2025, the day after the attack, the Chicago Police Department and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives began their investigation. Investigators reviewed surveillance footage from multiple sources, and what they found made the case against Lawrence Reed overwhelming. The gas station surveillance showed Reed filling a plastic bottle with gasoline approximately 20 to 30 minutes before the attack. His face was clearly visible on camera. There was no question about his identity. The train surveillance captured the entire attack sequence. Reed standing up, walking toward Bethany, pouring the gasoline, chasing her, igniting the bottle, setting her on fire, and then walking away. Witness statements from passengers corroborated what the video showed. and physical evidence tied Reed directly to the crime because he had burns on his right hand consistent with handling fire. That evening, on November 18th, Lawrence Reed was arrested in the 100 block of West Washington Street in Chicago. He was wearing the same clothing seen in the surveillance footage, and he was taken into custody by ATF. On November 20th, Reed made his first appearance in federal court. He wasn't being charged in state court for assault or attempted murder. He was being charged federally with committing a terrorist attack or violence against a mass transportation system, a charge that had never been used in Chicago before and carried a maximum penalty of life in federal prison. If Bethany died from her injuries, Reed could face the death penalty. What happened in that courtroom was bizarre, even by the standards of someone with Reed's history. As soon as Reed entered the courtroom, he began shouting, "I plead guilty," over and over again, yelling over the judge as the judge tried to advise him of his rights. When the judge attempted to explain the charges and the legal process, Reed sang out loud to drown out the judge's voice. Reed claimed to be a Chinese citizen and asked for the Chinese consulate to be notified. After the judge confirmed the terrorism charge against him, Reed insisted 5 separate times that he wanted to represent himself and declined legal counsel repeatedly. The judge and prosecutors agreed that Reed needed a psychological evaluation because he appeared unable or unwilling to cooperate with the most basic court proceedings. 2 days later, on November 22nd, Reed appeared for his detention hearing, where the judge would decide whether to release him on bail or keep him in custody. Reed agreed to detention, telling the judge, "I'm a target from society, and I don't feel safe out there, so I think, for my safety, it's best for me to be detained." Reed declined counsel 3 more times and continued insisting he wanted to represent himself. His main concern during the hearing wasn't the charges against him or the potential life sentence he was facing. His main concern was whether he'd get 3 meals a day in detention. He asked the judge repeatedly about food, wanting assurance that he wouldn't go hungry while awaiting trial. During the hearing, he made eye contact with 2 people in the audience, a man and a woman whom he apparently knew. The woman cried and shook her head at Reed as she watched the proceedings. As Reed was being led out of the courtroom, the woman shouted, "Dad." Reed didn't look back. The federal prosecutor addressed the court and called the attack horrific, gruesome, and barbaric. The prosecutor argued that Reed was simply too dangerous for pretrial release and stated that the defendant's actions and criminal history demonstrate that he is a serious danger to everyone in the community. The prosecutor continued by noting that the state court system has been unable to contain the defendant's violent crimes, and federal intervention is now needed, and emphasized that the defendant has been leniently treated in state court, including receiving probationary sentences for violent offenses and pretrial release for a victim-involved crime. In exchange for such lenient treatment, the defendant has consistently reoffended and delved further into criminality. Christopher Amon, the special agent in charge of ATF's Chicago Field Division, released a statement saying, "Lawrence Reed had no business being on the streets, given his violent criminal history and his pending criminal cases. Reed had plenty of second chances by the criminal justice system, and as a result, you have an innocent victim in the hospital fighting for her life. Because of the swift action of CPD, ATF, and our law enforcement partners, there will be no more chances for Mr. Reed." Lawrence Reed was ordered held without bail and remained in federal custody awaiting trial. He's currently representing himself, has undergone a psychological evaluation, and faces life in federal prison if convicted. But the question everyone was asking wasn't whether he'd be convicted because the evidence against him was overwhelming. The question was, how is he free in the first place? Bethany McGee remains in critical condition at Stroger Hospital's burn unit as of late November 2025. She's expected to be hospitalized for at least 3 months while undergoing surgeries and treatment for the burns, covering 60% of her body, with the most severe damage concentrated on her left arm and hand. Her family has released a statement thanking the medical staff, caring for her, and asking for prayers. Her church community has organized support, coordinating meal trains, prayer vigils, and messages of encouragement for Bethany and her family. Friends describe Bethany as a fighter who's determined to recover, but everyone who knows her understands the long and painful road ahead. Recovery from burns this extensive isn't just about surviving the initial trauma, Bethany will face months and likely years of painful treatments, including multiple skin graft surgeries where healthy skin from unburned areas of her body will be harvested and transplanted to cover the burned areas. She'll undergo debridement procedures to remove dead tissue, a process that's excruciating even with pain medication. Beyond the physical treatments, Bethany will need extensive physical therapy to regain mobility and function in her burned limbs, particularly her left arm and hand. Burn scars contract as they heal, which can limit range of motion and require ongoing stretching and rehabilitation to prevent permanent disability. And then there's the psychological trauma. Bethany will need counseling to process what happened to her, to deal with the PTSD that almost certainly follows an attack this violent and traumatic, to cope with the changes to her appearance, and to rebuild her sense of safety in the world after being set on fire by a stranger on public transit. She'll carry the physical and emotional scars of this attack for the rest of her life. And while Bethany fights to recover, her case has sparked a national conversation about criminal justice reform, bail policies, electronic monitoring, mental health treatment, and how the system handles repeat offenders. On November 24th, just 1 week after the attack, Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy publicly identified Bethany and posted on X. It is devastating that a career criminal with 72 prior arrests is now accused of attacking 6-year-old Bethany McGee on Chicago's L train and setting her on fire. This would never have happened if this thug had been behind bars. Yet Chicago lets repeat offenders roam the streets. Chicago's carelessness is putting the American people at risk. No one should ever have to fear for their life on the subway. Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson responded by calling the case an absolute failure of our criminal justice and mental health institutions. However, Johnson also called the incident isolated on the CTA, a characterization that drew criticism given Reed's 72 arrests and the fact that similar attacks had occurred on public transit systems across the country. Johnson later clarified that while the attack itself might be isolated in terms of this specific type of violence on Chicago trains, it certainly wasn't isolated for Lawrence Reed, whose lengthy criminal record showed a clear pattern of escalating violence that the system had failed to contain. The White House seized on Bethany's attack as justification for deploying the National Guard to Chicago to address public safety concerns on mass transit, arguing that local authorities had proven unable or unwilling to protect riders from violent criminals. The case also drew immediate comparisons to another recent attack that had shocked the nation just 3 months earlier. On the 22nd of August 2025, a Ukrainian refugee named Irina Zarutska was riding a light rail train in Charlotte, North Carolina, when a man approached her and slit her throat in an unprovoked attack. Zarutska died from her injuries. The suspect in that case, Dontavius Brown, had an extensive criminal history spanning nearly 20 years, documented mental illness, and a clear pattern of violence. Like Lawrence Reed, Brown had been free on cashless bail despite his history. Like Lawrence Reed, the system had given him chance after chance. Like Lawrence Reed, he used his freedom to attack an innocent person on public transit. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Repeat offenders with extensive criminal histories and documented mental health issues being released by the system, violating the terms of their release, and then attacking innocent people who were simply trying to get from one place to another. But Bethany McGee's case exposed specific, documented failures that occurred at every single level of the system, and those failures deserve to be examined one by one. Failure number 1, the 2020 arson conviction. In April 2020, Lawrence Reed set a fire outside the Thompson Center, a government building in downtown Chicago, just minutes before Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker was scheduled to give a COVID-19 press conference inside. This wasn't a small fire set by accident. This was arson at a government building where the governor was about to speak. Reed was arrested, charged with aggravated arson, and convicted. And the system's response? Probation. No prison time, just probation. The message the system sent to Lawrence Reed was crystal clear. You can set fire to a government building and face no real consequences. You can commit arson and walk away with supervision that requires you to check in occasionally and follow some rules, but you won't lose your freedom. Reed's probation ended on the 28th of December 2023, and he walked away having learned that arson isn't serious enough to warrant prison time. Failure number 2, the August 2025 hospital assault. In August 2025, just 3 months before Reed attacked Bethany, he was a psychiatric patient at McNeil Hospital in Berwyn, Illinois. While he was there receiving treatment, he allegedly struck and punched a social worker in the head and face. The social worker wasn't some random stranger who'd provoked Reed. The social worker was a healthcare professional doing their job, trying to help Reed. And Reed attacked them. Reed was arrested and charged with aggravated battery, a serious felony charge that should have resulted in him being held in custody, especially given his extensive criminal record that included 72 prior arrests and multiple felony convictions. Prosecutors looked at Reed's record, looked at the new charge, and objected to his release. They told the judge explicitly that Reed was dangerous and should remain in jail while awaiting trial. The judge disagreed. The judge released Reed on electronic monitoring, which meant Reed would be fitted with an ankle bracelet that would track his location and enforce a curfew requiring him to stay at an assigned residence during certain hours. The technology tracks the defendant's location 24/7, alerts authorities if they violate their curfew or enter restricted areas, and creates consequences for non-compliance. But electronic monitoring only works if someone is actually watching the alerts and if someone takes action when violations occur. The message the system sent to Reed with that release was, "Violence against healthcare workers isn't serious enough to keep you in jail, and we trust you to follow the rules even though you've been arrested 72 times and have never followed the rules." Failure number 3, the electronic monitoring violations. In November
2025,
Lawrence Reed violated his electronic monitoring curfew 5 times in just over 1 week. November 9th, curfew violation detected. Alert issued, no action taken. November 12th, curfew violation detected. Alert issued, no action taken. November 14th, curfew violation detected. Alert issued, no action taken. November 15th, curfew violation detected. Alert issued, no action taken. That same day, Reed was suspected of attempting to set the Chicago City Hall County building on fire, though he was never charged with that incident. November 17th, the day Reed attacked Bethany. Curfew violation detected at 9:13 a.m., more than 12 hours before the attack. 2 escalated alerts were issued, one at 12:13 p.m. and another 12 hours later. Nobody did anything. The attack happened at 9:30 p.m. that same night, and Reed was violating his curfew at the exact moment he was setting Bethany on fire. Think about that timeline. Reed violated his curfew in the morning. Alerts were issued throughout the day. He attacked Bethany that night. And the person whose job it was to monitor Reed and alert the court to violations didn't tell anyone until 2 days later, after the damage was done. The electronic monitoring system had worked exactly as designed. It detected the violations, it issued alerts, it created a record of Reed's non-compliance. But nobody acted on that information until it was too late. The message the system sent to Reed was, "Electronic monitoring is performative, not protective. You can violate your curfew as many times as you want and nothing will happen. The ankle bracelet is just jewelry that beeps occasionally, but there are no real consequences for ignoring it." Failure number 4, loss of housing oversight. Reed was supposed to be living at assigned transitional housing while on electronic monitoring. The court had designated specific locations where Reed was required to stay, and his ankle monitor was programmed to enforce those boundaries. But by November
2025,
Reed was AWOL from his assigned housing. He'd been bouncing between various shelters across Chicago, and the system had essentially lost track of where he was actually living. Records show Reed had stayed at a shelter on Princeton Avenue for less than a month at some point, a couple of months ago. On September 30th, he was assigned to a second shelter in the 10000 block of South Avenue N, but it's unclear if he ever actually stayed there or was assigned somewhere else afterward. The system was supposed to know where Reed was living so they could monitor him, check on him, ensure he was complying with the terms of his release, and locate him quickly if he violated those terms. But they didn't know. They'd lost him in the shuffle of transitional housing and shelters, and Reed was free to move around Chicago without anyone tracking his actual location beyond the vague geographic boundaries his ankle monitor allowed. The message: we don't actually know where dangerous people are, and we're not that concerned about finding out. This isn't just about Lawrence Reed. This is about a system that gave probation for arson at a government building, released a violent offender on electronic monitoring despite prosecutors objecting, failed to act on 5 curfew violations in 1 week, lost track of where a supposedly monitored offender was living, and allowed a man with 72 arrests to walk Chicago streets freely without effective mental health treatment or supervision. And Bethany McGee, a 26-year-old business analyst who went to church with her family, loved animals, and was simply riding the train home on a Sunday night, paid the price for every single one of those failures. Right now, at this very moment, there are people like Lawrence Reed walking free in cities across America, people with dozens of arrests, violent histories, documented mental illness, and ankle monitors that flash warnings nobody acts on. The system keeps releasing them, keeps giving them chances, keeps hoping they'll somehow stop being dangerous without any real intervention or consequences. And innocent people keep getting hurt. Bethany McGee's case has forced a national conversation about whether the current approach to bail reform, electronic monitoring, and treating repeat offenders with mental illness is working, or whether it's simply creating more victims while making policymakers feel good about reducing incarceration rates. There are no easy answers to these questions. Mental illness is real, and people deserve treatment, not just incarceration. Locking up everyone with mental health issues isn't humane and doesn't solve the underlying problems. Electronic monitoring is cheaper than incarceration and allows defendants to maintain jobs, family connections, and community ties while awaiting trial. These are all legitimate considerations that shouldn't be dismissed. But there's a difference between reforming a broken system and abandoning accountability entirely. There's a difference between treating mental illness and ignoring violent behavior. There's a difference between giving someone a second chance and giving someone a 73rd chance after they've proven over and over again that they're a danger to others. Lawrence Reed had been given probation for arson. He'd been released on electronic monitoring despite prosecutors' objections. He'd violated his monitoring 5 times in 1 week, and nobody stopped him. At what point does the system prioritize protecting innocent people like Bethany McGee over giving endless chances to people like Lawrence Reed who've demonstrated they'll use those chances to hurt others? That's the question this case forces us to confront, and it's a question that doesn't have a simple answer but demands an honest one. Bethany McGee was 26 years old. She worked at Caterpillar as a business analyst. She went to church with her family. She loved animals. She was riding the train home. Lawrence Reed had been arrested 72 times over 30 years. He'd been convicted of arson and given probation instead of prison. He'd assaulted a healthcare worker and been released on electronic monitoring despite prosecutors telling the judge he was dangerous. He violated his curfew 5 times in 1 week, and nobody stopped him. On the 17th of November
2025,
those 2 lives collided on a Chicago train platform, and Bethany McGee paid the price for every failure the system made over Lawrence Reed's 30-year criminal career. She's alive, fighting through months of painful recovery, surrounded by family and community support who refuse to let her face this alone. But the question we need to ask is, how many more Bethanys will it take before the system stops giving endless chances to people who've proven they'll use them to hurt others? If this case made you angry, if you think the system needs to change, subscribe to this channel for more stories where the system failed and families had to fight for justice. Thank you for watching.